Let me begin this morning with a story, and here's the story. A girl was rescued. Now, it's a fine story. In fact, if you're sympathetic with small children who might be in some type of crisis, you're glad that the little girl was rescued, but the story in and of itself, as a simple statement, doesn't have a lot of meaning to you. It doesn't have a lot of interest, if you will. But let me give you the backstory. The backstory is that in 1987, a mother was outside of her backyard and she was watching 4 other children and her own daughter play. The phone rings and she goes inside. And it's about time she's finished with the phone call, she hears screaming. She comes outside and the other children are screaming because her daughter, who's only 18 months old at that time, she falls down into a well. Now, when we think of a well, if you don't have a well in your backyard, you may think of something large. This well was only 8 inches in diameter. In order for her to do that, what had to happen is one leg had to come up near her head, the rest of her body fit tightly in there, and she fell 22 feet down at the bottom of this well. They could hear her crying. They knew she was still alive, and so she immediately called the policemen. They arrived there in about 3 minutes, and they got there on the scene quickly, but they didn't know at all what to do. How are they going to handle this situation? Well, other first responders came, and they're actually in Midland, Texas, so this is a town that has a lot of oil rigging equipment, and they knew actually how to drill inside of the ground. If you remember that time, a lot of the men were laid off, and so they immediately got to work. They said, what we'll do in this long shaft that's 22 feet down where this little girl is trapped, we'll actually drill beside it and then we can get her. But they immediately hit rock so hard that they couldn't penetrate it. And so, shockingly and terrifyingly, the little girl spent the night there, 24 hours inside of that well. They found a way to communicate to her. They found a way to get her food. They could hear her talking inside of there, crying inside of there, but they didn't know what to do. Finally, an engineer shows up on the scene, and what they decide to do is using a new technology where they're using water pressure to actually drill down into the rock and drill to the side. But that takes another day, and so now 48 hours go by, and she's still inside of that well. Finally, after 58 hours, they drill down, they drill sideways. A rescuer is able to go down the shaft, across the shaft, bring her up and out of the large shaft. She's lifted up, hoisted up by a crane, the rescuer and herself. And finally, after all of that time, a little girl is rescued. Maybe you remember that story of Jess McClure from 1987. But the statement, someone's rescued, only has meaning if you understand the backstory. This time of year is significant because in the church year we celebrate Easter, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. This is the capstone of what we call Holy Week. And even in our very Christianized culture, if you will, here in Little Rock, Arkansas, we hear the phrase Jesus Christ rose from the dead, but if you don't know the backstory, you may not know the significance of that. In fact, you may have even wondered, why do people make seemingly a bigger deal out of Easter than they do at Christmas? Why is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead so significant? In fact, listen to what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 17. He says this, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. The word there means worthless, meaningless. Actually, the weight of the Greek word is this, it's empty. So if Jesus is not raised from the dead, then our lives are meaningless. We're empty. We're void of anything that has meaning and significance. All of it hinges upon the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And why would we say that? Well, you have to understand the backstory. And so let's begin at the beginning. God created everything in the Garden of Eden. You know the story of Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 3 records that sin enters into the garden. The snake, representing Satan, tempts Adam and Eve, and they fall into sin. And after that sin, some curses were brought upon the ground, upon the snake, upon the woman, and upon the man. But when God was cursing the snake, he said something very specific. He said, I'm going to put enmity, tension, between your seed, all future snakes, and the seed of the woman, all future humans. And you might recognize that tension in your own life if you hate snakes, but it's deeper than that. It has more spiritual meaning. God goes on to say to Eve, or the snake says this, I will put you in a position where you are going to bruise the heel of the woman's seed, but her seed will bruise your head. Now, what's hinted at there, in kind of a shadowy sort of way, is that the idea that there might be a plan here at play. That although Satan is going to constantly be at the heel of humans, and he's always going to be tempting them and trying to bring them down and bring destruction to their lives, that there's someone that's going to come from the seed of the woman, someone born as a human, who's going to rise up and be the snake crusher, who's going to ultimately bring down defeat upon the kingdom of darkness and establish a kingdom of light. Now, what did that mean to the first people who read those words? Well, they didn't know. It was hinted at, but again, it was a shadowy, incomplete type of plan. They just didn't know. Well, what happens next is that the human race grows, the human race prospers, if you will, but they're totally defiant against God. They don't acknowledge Him as their creator. They defy His will. They live in a way that's terrible and immoral. God destroys the world, and He starts it over with a new family, Noah's family. You know the story of Noah and the ark. But when Noah's family begins to repopulate the earth, the same problems happen. They're still defiant against God, and it's a great lesson to us that even with a total remake, with a total do-over, we could still mess things up. And so here's what God decides to do. Instead of remaking the world again, instead of destroying it and recreate it, He takes the whole global family that exists and He plants within that whole global family one special family. It's found in Genesis chapter 12 where God calls Abraham to Himself and says, Abraham, I'm going to make from you, from your individual life, from your seed, an entire race of special chosen people. They're going to be a blessing to all the people of the world. I'm going to give you this special land, and you're going to have this massive nation that's going to come from you. So he had a son. His son had a son. God changed his name to Israel, and that's where we have the 12 tribes of Israel, God's chosen people. Out of necessity, they moved into Egypt to save themselves from famine. They grew into this great nation. And as you know, as a church, we're studying Exodus, how God led them out of that to continue His promise that He made to Abraham. And so connecting this idea from the Garden of Eden to what God did with Abraham, we still see the hints of a plan. God is going to raise up this snake crusher, and He's going to defeat the evil one. And there's hints of that there in the life, the promise that God has given to Abraham, that He's going to make them this great nation. They prosper in Egypt, they come out, and then God begins the process of leading them into the promised land. And it's there, after a while inside of that promised land, that God does two things of great significance. First, He raises up a great king in David, and these are the golden years. God's people are living an incredibly prosperous life. King David is a great warrior, and everything is really well in Jerusalem. And he has a son named Solomon. Under Solomon, the second significant thing happens, is that God leads him to build a temple. And the temple is significant because this is the place that God's people would relate to Himself. And then also, barring from a temporary temple they had earlier, the tabernacle, God formalizes something that would take place on a regular basis inside the temple. Now listen to this, because this is a big part of the plan that's developing. What's developed is a sacrificial system. That weekly they would bring animal sacrifices to the temple. And then one special day, one day of the year called the Day of Atonement, these special sacrifices were made for all the sins of the people. Now, what was a sacrifice? Well, a sacrifice was generally an animal sacrifice. It could be other things if you didn't have money to provide a sacrifice. But the significance of the sacrifice is that it was, in the same way that we would use the word, a sacrifice. The animals were very significant to their monetary system. They had tremendous value. And so if you took one of the sheep from your fold and you gave it to the temple to be sacrificed, you had given up something. You had genuinely sacrificed. but it was also sacrifice in another sense, in a spiritual sense, a theological sense. That when that animal was taken to the priest, and that priest would cut the animal's throat and sacrifice the animal and spill the blood, we asked that question, Easy and I was describing this, why would God allow this to an animal? The animal had done nothing wrong, and if you thought that, then you're really on to a part of the plan, because that's exactly the point. What God did is he looked down upon his people, knowing that they were sinful and knowing that God was holy, knowing that they couldn't approach him because he was holy and they were sinful. And so what God did is he said, I have to punish you as a result of my sin, as a result of your sin. But what I'll do is, instead of punishing you, I'll redirect that away from the animal and I'll put that punishment on the animal. So in this sense, the animal was a sacrifice because it was a substitute. God redirected his wrath toward me, but he redirected it upon the animal that was innocent. And now the guilty person, those that were in the nation of Israel, could be treated as innocent because the lamb had taken their place for them. And this, for many, many years, was how God related to his people. So we learn a couple of things about God's relationship with his people, and we learn a couple of things about this plan that's here in still kind of a shadowy type of form. We learn that, first of all, that God's a holy God. He demands justice. It's not something we can easily wrap our minds around. It's not something that's popular to think about or to talk about. The reality is God dwells in absolute perfection, and he demands absolute perfection for those who will come into his presence. No one can stand before God who has sin. God, knowing that all people had sinned, provided a way that they could relate to him. So we learn that God's holy, but the second thing we learn about God is that he's loving. Because knowing that we could never meet the demands of his justice, and knowing that the Israelites, his chosen people, could never meet the demands of his justice, he provided a way that they could relate to him. So all of this is what we'd call the story of the Old Testament, how this plan is developing. That God had brought his people into the land. They had this great kingdom under David, although they would lose that great kingdom. He did establish this sacrificial system in the temple, a way by which God could relate to his people. Then, after about 300 to 400 years, after the last chapter of the Old Testament is written, we have in our Bible Matthew chapter 1. This is the story of the arrival of Jesus Christ. Jesus, you know the story, Luke chapter 2, was born in Bethlehem. He was born of a virgin birth, meaning that while he had a human mother, God was his father. But the reality is, John 1 teaches us that Jesus was never initially created. In other words, he had no beginning and no end, because Jesus was and is God. In the same way that God has no beginning and God has no end, Jesus Christ had no beginning and had no end. There was just one moment in time where he chose to enter into a human form. That's what we call his incarnation. Inside of flesh, Jesus came, but he always existed and always will exist. Just for that moment in time, he came down and God lived among men. Now, of all the things that Jesus did, I want to think about just 3. Here's the first one. Jesus taught. He taught about the kingdom. His big theme was the kingdom. And remember, his audience primarily were Jews, and so they were thinking about, the glory days under David. We want that kingdom back restored. And all the time when David was there was predicting there would be another Messiah who would come and restore the kingdom back. And so the people that were following Jesus were thinking, this is it. This is the Messiah. So the plan was hinted at back in Genesis chapter 3. It was hinted at even more under Abraham. And through all the time that God was leading his people, this plan was hinted at. And maybe Jesus is this Messiah, this rescuer, this deliverer, who's going to come and bring all of this plan and allow it to make sense. So Jesus taught that that was in fact the case. He was the king of the kingdom. He knew the plan, and he was bringing the plan to fulfillment. He taught. And the second thing that Jesus did of real significance is that he performed miracles. So blind people, when Jesus touched them, could see. And And deaf people could hear. People who were generally had debilitating paralysis could actually walk after that. And Jesus, even in 2 occasions, raised people from the dead. He showed he had this power over all the molecular structure of the world. He could control that, and he healed people. But have you ever wondered why Jesus performed these miracles? Well, Jesus just didn't perform the miracles just to show off that he was God. Again, all the earth answers to him because he created all things. So if he wanted to make mountains disappear or great waves and sea monsters come out of the ocean or whatever bizarre thing we could think of as humans, he could do all of that, but he did none of that. And why did he perform these miracles? Well, it wasn't just to show off. And you can say, well, he performed the miracles because he was genuinely compassionate. I mean, people who are hungry need food. And so he created a lot of food out of a few loaves and a few fish. People who really did need to hear and they really did need to see. So Jesus had compassion on the people. And that's true. That's recorded in Matthew 9:36. Jesus had compassion. But that wasn't the only reason. Because while Jesus healed many people, he didn't heal all the people. So why did Jesus perform these miracles? Well, the answer is actually given in John chapter 5. Let me read this. You can turn to it if you like. John chapter 5. And listen to what Jesus said in John chapter 5 in verse 36. He said, "The works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me." Now, this is just so interesting. Jesus didn't wake up and think, I'll do this today and I'll do that and maybe I'll heal somebody over here. He's saying that actually he was working off of a set, preordained list of things, if you will, that God wanted him to accomplish. The things that the Father wanted me to accomplish. In fact, earlier Jesus said in verse 30, "I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me." So Jesus wasn't doing everything he could do as God. He was doing specific things. Why? Well, the answer is given there in verse 36. "Because they bear witness about me that the Father has sent me." In other words, Jesus wasn't just doing all the things that he could do, but Jesus was doing exactly what the Father wanted him to do for the purpose that we would understand that he was the plan. This actually is the one who this actually was the one who God sent to be the snake crusher. This is the one who was going to bring fulfillment to all the plan. This is the one who, by bringing life from death, was going to show that he was the one that God organized all along to bring fulfillment and completion to this plan. This was it. And this is really the third thing that Jesus did of great significance, is that he provided hope. In fact, Isaiah chapter 61 gives a very specific list of miracles that the Messiah was going to accomplish, and Jesus did all of those. And so, yes, Jesus was teaching, and yes, he was performing miracles, but probably the biggest thing that he did was give hope to people who were desperate, and they were lost, and they were suffering under economic stress and horrible conditions, and Jesus was providing hope to all of them. He came to bring the plan to completion. And then he died. He died. Now, why did Jesus die? Well, the reason that Jesus died is very simple. It goes back to, remember that temple structure that we talked about. Jesus didn't die because he had his life taken from him. He was very clear about that. He died because he actually laid down his life. Jesus taught that all the lambs that were sacrificed way back, beginning with the Passover and even beginning with the sacrifices that Noah made, all of these sacrifices that were made were all anticipating, they were kind of shadowy introductions to parts of the plan that Jesus would finally come. And he would be God's sacrificial lamb. So now, the system that God had where he would allow people to have a relationship with him through the sacrificial system is expanded, if you will, to all humanity. And God looks at your sin and he looks at my sin. And he says this essentially: your sin makes you incapable. It's impossible of you coming into my presence. But what I'll do is all the anger I feel for your sin, I'll put all of that on the person of Jesus. And so the anger I feel to you, I'm redirecting that. I'm putting on Jesus. And Jesus' death on the cross was not just man killing another man. This was actually God allowing his lifeblood to be drained out of him so that in the spilling of his blood, God would never shed my blood. And the guilty person now can be treated like innocent because the innocent person, the spotless Lamb of God who had never done anything wrong, was my substitute. All of our life comes from his death. So now let me look at you and just ask this question. Have you made that exchange? Have you said, God, look, I don't want to stand before you bearing the weight of my own sin. I want Jesus to bear that weight for me. And if that's what you do want, then just stop right now and call upon the name of the Lord. Just cry out to him right now and say, God, I want you in my life. I want you to forgive me of my sin. I trust in what Jesus did on the cross and not myself. I want him to be my substitute. And I give my life to follow you. The fact that Jesus rose from the fact that Jesus died on the cross is the greatest news we could have, because it means that God allows the substitute of Christ to take my place. It's very, very good news. But we still haven't addressed some very, very bad news. And that is that Jesus is still dead. And the bad news for those who were there, his original followers, is that he had the keys to all the plan. You see, all the connections we've made between Genesis, the very beginning of things, to Exodus and the sacrificial system, all those connections to Jesus, they didn't know, they didn't understand. No one could explain it to them. And Jesus could explain it to them. He can connect all of the dots from all of human history, but he's dead. So he can't. Now we're back to John chapter 20. If you're still there, look at it, John chapter 20. And let's pick up where we left off reading a little bit earlier. John chapter 20. Look at what we said in verse 8. Just to repeat what happened. John and Peter are running to the tomb. Peter goes in to look. Then John goes in to look. And verse 8 says, then the other disciple, this is speaking of John, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet, listen to this, they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. When Jesus was still in the tomb, they didn't understand it. All the secrets of how God was going to wrap up all the plan of human history, they were wrapped up in the tomb with Jesus. Imagine someone has a book, and in the book is the cure to cancer. And in the book is all the secrets of the origin of the universe. And imagine it's only one copy of the book, and they set a match to it and it goes away. That would be horrible, but it would be of less significance than this. That all the reason God created me, everything that makes sense about your life and my life, all hinges upon Jesus, but he's in the tomb. And once John sees him raised, all of a sudden the plan begins to clarify. It begins to crystallize in his mind. That Jesus, by his death, would pay the price. He would be that sacrificial lamb that would allow us to have a relationship. But by his rising from the dead, he proves that now he was absolute God and that this was simply a part of the plan from the very beginning. So, when you hear the phrase, Jesus rose from the dead, please understand the backstory. That it's in that resurrection from death to life, and only in that resurrection from death to life can you have resurrection from death to life.